So we've established now a few things. Number one, what it means to put in mind. Number two, what it means to be subject. And number three, who we're to be subject to. We're to be subject to principalities and powers. Now, I love how this verse reads. Because if you missed what it means to be subject, it's going to define it for you right here in the same verse. Read the verse. Put them in mind to be subject to principalities and powers and to what? Obey magistrates. So what does it mean to be subject? It means to obey. Okay? So the believer is told also to obey magistrates, which essentially means to obey a ruler or a superior. Okay? So you need to keep something in mind. That Crete, when Paul writes this epistle to Timothy under inspiration, Crete was a Roman province of the Roman Empire. A totalitarian dictatorship run by one guy. What is the instruction given to the believer? To obey principalities and what? Powers. It is not determined by the form of government. Republican, Democratic, Republican with a small r, meaning a republic, okay? Democratic, authoritarian, oligopoly, whatever it is. I said the wrong word. I didn't want oligopoly. That's an economic structure. What word did I want? Oligarchy, thank you. Okay? Oligarchy, whatever it is. Monarchy, it's immaterial. The believer is to be subject to whoever the ruling authority is, regardless of the political structure. Now, we could certainly make the argument that there are certainly a lot of political structures that you would rather live under than others, but that doesn't matter. Because Paul does not say, well, you know, this is an authoritarian dictatorship, so you don't have to listen to them. He didn't say that. He said what? You need to be submissive and what? Obey that governmental structure. Now, so it was a totalitarian government which exercised complete, absolute, total control over the lives of those who lived under it. So for believers to rebel against this type of authority would mean certain what? Death. And we just studied in Sunday school this morning how when Nero got mad because the people didn't like him enough after the fire in the city of Rome, he blamed the fire on who? The Christians. And then he goes out and starts to persecute the Christians. So the government, Paul, who had just been released from prison, Paul had been incarcerated by this government. This government had taken him and brought him to Rome and put him there under house arrest, in my opinion, falsely accused, before he had his hearing before Caesar and was eventually released. So if there's anybody on earth that knew what it meant to deal with an authoritarian dictatorial power, it was the Apostle Paul. And he says that the believer is to be what? Subject and obey. Not willy-nilly, okay? Not when you feel like it. Paul had just been released from prison and knew full well the power of the Caesars and their ability to make life difficult for the believer. He knew that firsthand. Come with me, if you would, to 1 Timothy chapter 2. Now, I'll just ask you this on a face value. 1 Timothy chapter 2. Where would you rather live? Under the authoritarian dictatorship of the Caesars or under a government like we have? Whatever you think is wrong with the government, and Lord knows there's probably quite a bit, okay? Whatever you think is wrong with it, I'd still rather live under that system than that other one. Okay? Because in the system that we have, I at least have some say in what happens to me. Maybe not as much as I would like, but there's a mechanism, it's called voting. Right? I don't want to talk to you like your high school kids. Okay? So that's one of the big things, is you've got to talk them into voting, okay? 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1. I exhort, therefore, that first of all, supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men. Verse 2, for kings and for all them that are in authority. so that the guys that we like will get elected. Is that what the verse said? So that they will pass all the legislation that we want them to pass. Is that what the verse said? Oh, isn't that interesting? Because if you listen to most Christians talk about the government, isn't that the way they view it? But what did Paul say? Verse 2, for kings and for all them that are in authority, that, here is the reason, here is the purpose, here is the intent of why the believer is instructed to pray for the government and for kings and for those in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and what? 1 Timothy, written about the same time as Titus, Paul instructs Timothy to pray for kings and those in authority, not so that the government will do everything the way we want them to, but so that believers may lead a quiet and peaceable life. You know what Paul knew? Paul knew that the secular authorities possessed the ability to make life difficult for believers. And when he writes, Paul wrote 1 Timothy and Titus on the eve of the first great persecution of Christians under the Roman Emperor Nero. And depending on whose dating you want to use, you can make the argument that the persecution was already underway when he writes 1 Timothy. Why do we pray for the government? So that the government will do everything we want them to do? Or so that we as believers, see, what I want is for the government to just stay out of it and let the church be the church. Let the church... One of the biggest problems with a state church is you have the state interfering with the church. You see that? What the prayer here is not for all the people that we want to get elected and everything to go the way we want it to, and for all the legislation to be passed or not passed the way we want it. That's not the point. The point is that Paul knew is that the governmental authorities had the capacity to make life difficult for the believer. And the believer should pray for the government to the end that the believer can continue to live a quiet and peaceable what? Life. Now we'll talk more about that in a minute. So I have a question. How much time do you as a believer spend praying for the government as opposed to complaining about it? See, that one reads my meter too. Okay? That one reads my meter too. But if you're going to have a scriptural mindset about how the believer should view the government, that verse tells you a lot about how you should view it, doesn't it? Now that we've, go back to Titus chapter 3, now that we've sort of understood the verse as it's written, I want to go over, let's see here, about 7 scriptural principles, okay, of a scriptural view of human government with you to help you in your thinking. Come with me to Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 9. Principle number 1. God created human government to deter evil. Principle number 1. God created human government to deter evil. Now, within that statement, you basically have 2 concepts, right? Number 1, where did human government come from? God. God gave mankind the ability and the right to rule in the earth. Okay? When the universe was created, the Godhead created it with governmental structures in it. Okay? He puts Adam on the earth, and he tells Adam to rule over and subdue what? The earth. Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 9, verse 4. Now, before we get in, what's the context of Genesis chapter 9? It's Genesis chapter 6, right? That God looks at the earth, and He sees that the thoughts and the intents and the imaginations of the heart of man are only evil continually. And there's only one man on the earth and his family that God can look at with any sort of respect, and that's Noah and his family. And so God sends a flood and destroys all of humanity except who? Noah and his family. And what you're reading in chapter 9 of Genesis is now they've left the ark, and here's what God's telling Noah and his family after they've left the ark. Verse 4. verse 5. But surely your blood of your lives will I require. At the hand of every beast will I require it. At the hand of man, at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Verse 6, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be what? Shed. For in the image of God made he what? Somebody said, Brother Ross, do you believe in the death penalty? Yes, absolutely I believe in the death penalty. Why? Because that verse right there says that God gave mankind the ability on earth to exercise judgment and justice in the earth. You've got to ask yourself, why? Was there any, before the flood, was there any such mechanism instituted in the Word of God? No. So there was no deterrent to evil. So before the flood, mankind could just chase and run after evil, and there was no mechanism in the earth to deter that from occurring. And so after the flood, so as to try to prevent a reoccurrence of the state of man before the flood, one of the things God institutes here is the principle of human government. You follow that? Let me turn the fan on. It's getting hot up here. Excuse me. Come with me, if you would, to Romans chapter 13. Paul elaborates on this a little bit in Romans chapter 13. Listen, has human government been affected by dispensational change? To some extent, but is the principle of human government still there? Yes. Okay? It is what we call a trans-dispensational issue. It is going to apply in every dispensation from the time that it is enacted until Christ comes up and sets up a perfect government. We'll talk about that in a minute. Romans chapter 13, verse 1. Let every soul be subject. There it is again. Be what? Subject unto the higher powers. For there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. We'll talk about what that means in a few minutes. Verse 2. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. Now look at verse 3. For rulers are, same word as magistrates, by the way. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to what? Evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. Verse 4, for he is the minister of God to thee. Notice, but if thou do that which is evil, be what? Afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is a minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth what? Evil. Principle number 1. God created human government for the purpose of deterring what? Evil. Unrestrained evil, undeterred evil, resulted in the destruction of mankind through the flood. And so afterwards, God institutes the principle of human government. Gives mankind the right that if somebody kills someone, the government has the right to take their what? Their life. And the only reason that you need to be afraid of the government is if you are not doing what the government what? Says. We'll get to that in a minute too. I feel like I've said that a lot, but trust me, we will. Principle number 2. Human government follows the principles God established when He created it. Romans chapter 13, verse 1. Now, Romans chapter 13, verse 1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. Now, does that exclude anybody? No. For the powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of who? So what that verse is saying, if you're going to take the standard Christian interpretation, what that verse is saying is that the reason Hitler ran Germany was because it was God's will. The reason Stalin ran the Soviet Union is because that was God's will. Is that what that verse means?